Then came the night of the first falling star. Hello. Today we're looking at War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Now, I really enjoyed the second half of this. The first half, well, let's get into the actual summary, I guess. Acclaimed critically and by readers everywhere as possibly the greatest work of science fiction of all time. Okay, fair. There are 2 books included in this, and the first kind of outlines Martians come down to Britain, to England. We're introduced to the protagonist, who is a philosophical writer, and he is one of the first people to see the first cylinder containing Martians to come down into England. And then man tries to fight against the Martians. They lose because the Martians have all these cool things like heat rays and black smoke that kills you when you breathe it in. And then in the second book, it gets more personal with the narrator. So we see his brother kind of close out the first book with his adventures, and the second book opens with him being buried in this house, the narrator, not his brother, buried in this house with a partner that he gained near the middle part of the first book. And he's trapped under this house, like buried in rubble for several days. He ends up killing the guy that he's supposed to be protecting because they just can't get along, and they keep fighting over food and things, and they can't leave the house because the Martians will see them and they have no idea what's going on. He finally makes it out of the house. He partners up with a new guy. They think they're maybe the only 2 people left. Maybe there are others, and they have this philosophical conversation about men who are here to further the species and people who are here for leisure and all of this stuff. It's very it's very Ayn Rand or Brave New World in that moment. And then near the end, he departs from that partner as well because he doesn't think that he's taking the situation seriously enough. He finds that the Martians have been killed, not by man, but by disease and bacteria from Earth that the Martians weren't adapted to. Now, what's really cool here, some of my favorite moments are the description of the Martians themselves and his arguments on how they could have come to be the way that they are, because they're basically these giant globs with beaks and eyes and these little tendrils and a giant brain and no digestive system and apparently no emotion and all of these things. So Wells, through the narrator, argues that the highest form of an evolved being would be one that is almost entirely brain, just kind of this cool intelligence. And what's interesting, though, is he talks about the relationship between Martians and men being like the relationship between man and ants, and then he also alludes several times to different lessons that are learned by the narrator from nature, or he compares himself to different animals at different points in time. And so he argues that is probably the highest form of evolution that we can think of, but also argues that may not be the best way to be, because that same mindset is what he argues against when he compares the Martians' destruction of mankind, or attempted destruction of mankind, to mankind's destruction of the Earth. So Wells has a position familiar to people who have read some of the work of the American Romantics from a similar time period, mid to late 1800s, but expresses it in a completely novel way, which is awesome. The first half, what I was going to say about that is that it reads a little bit like an action movie, like a superhero movie or something, so I didn't enjoy it very much. When I read The Time Machine, for example, the fast-paced action-adventure stuff that Wells does is really hard for me to keep up with. I'll be turning the pages and I'll get lost and think, oh man, where are our characters now? What are they doing now? Whereas the second half is a bit more slow. It's a bit more psychologically interesting. The narrator kind of gets into talking about the darkness of the human soul and all of these really cool things. And then, of course, the conversation between he and the partner that he makes later, that he encounters and gains later. Now, I took some favorite quotes. Oh, here we go. So when he meets the second partner, they're talking about how people are starving in heaps, bolting, treading on each other. And then he describes those who are left as needing to have spirit in them, to have proud dreams and proud lusts. And then he argues that a man who hasn't one or the other, what is he but funk and precautions? I like his use of the word funk there. I found that interesting. Another favorite moment is when Wells is describing, or the narrator, Wells through the narrator is describing the Martians in their bodily form. He says, save for the helpless purposelessness of these movements, it was as if some wounded thing were struggling for its life amid the waves. Because they're these giant blob creatures that, can't really move around on Earth very well because the gravity is different, so they're so much heavier. So they have these machines, and so what's really cool is the contrast between the way that he describes them there and then what we see later when they're in these giant fighting machines with heat rays and the black smoke and everything. And then they eventually solve the problem of flight. They never get to use it, but they eventually figure out how to fly, which would have been a huge deal at this point in time. So I think it's really cool how he kind of talks down on these creatures, and then because of their manipulation of machinery, they're able to become the strongest thing on the planet, you know? One thing I appreciated is that because this was published in the 1800s, there's no like giant world-ending scale. I mean, it's talked about, but it's mostly confined to England because they didn't have the instant communication networks that we have now. So later we find out about how they knew about it in Dublin, and they knew about it in Berlin, and they knew about it in France, but they didn't, this says nothing about the Martians actually making their way across the entire planet. And so I thought that was really interesting because we are so quick now in action and sci-fi to jump to global consequences. And here they're implied, but they're not really talked about directly, which I thought was really cool. And some people might disagree with that. Some people might think that that kind of keeps it closed-minded. But you have to remember, this was published originally in serial form in periodicals. So the idea of keeping it confined mostly to England makes sense because most of the rest of the periodical is also going to be about England. So let me know what you think. If you like it, if you've read it, if you're watching this to get information about it. Sorry that it's more of a my thoughts thing than a summary, but I hope you enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day.